Hello, everyone. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, that's Community Advocates for Young Learners. And it is my pleasure to welcome you today and to thank you for joining us in this webinar. Every first Thursday of the month at 4 o'clock Eastern Time, we bring you these webinars to offer you timely and informative information about children, families, and the early childhood education profession. All of our webinars are always free, they're recorded, and they're available on our website. And we are particularly excited today because this is our 40th episode. So we are amazed by your participation and so grateful for it. After this webinar, as usual, you will receive an email of resources that are going to help you dig deeper into our topic today, which is on communication in our field. And so we look forward to you having a chance to dig deeper if you're inspired, as you will be by today's conversations. And for your convenience, today's webinar has closed captioning available. We always love to hear from you, so please write in the chat as we have this conversation together. You are our beloved early childhood education community, and we are so honored that our webinars have touched all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and we've had participation from 38 countries as well. So we are really thrilled. 2024 marks the 20th anniversary of the CAYL Institute. We're so grateful for your support. And this also gives us a chance to thank the Schott Foundation, who is our initial sponsor. And we also are grateful to them for sponsoring our webinar series this year. You too can be a supporter of the CAYL Institute. If you'd like to donate $20 for our 20th anniversary, we would be grateful for that. You can simply text the word CAYL to 53555, and any amount of your gift is always appreciated. Your gifts enable us to continue to offer no-cost programming like this webinar and the follow-up materials to the early childhood education community. So please make a tax-free donation of any amount if it pleases you to do so. Join us as we share your voices and shine a light on the need for a giant leap forward in our profession. And as we're taking this giant leap forward, we've been using the image of courage and to remind us to look back and to move forward in the work that we're doing. And now more than ever, we need to look back and think forward as we think about how we can communicate the value and need for our work. What messages are we sending? How are they being received? We know that James Baldwin said the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter, even by a millimeter, the way people look at reality, then you can change the world. So we know it often takes courage to communicate. It takes courage to tell our story. We know it's important to workforce. How we send messages about our work plays a very important role in advocacy and social change. Indeed, research has shown that we sometimes have messages that are unproductive or unproductive narratives that get in the way of getting support for our work. So that's why today we're excited to bring you two experts to talk about courage in the context of messaging. What choices do we have in how we present information and how people think and feel and act toward our work? How do we send messages that boost knowledge? How do we use information to change attitudes? How do we use information to get more allies? How do we help people think differently about their cultural mindsets about what it means to teach young children? How can we better think about appealing to issues like fairness, opportunity for all? These are things that we can learn to do better. Be sure to join us at the end of this webinar by clicking a link that will provide you at the end of the webinar if you want to interact with our two experts who are going to talk to us about this topic today. So let's get started. Let's start by asking you to write in the chat. What messages do you think are the most and the least effective about early childhood education? Let's hear what you have to say. Please write it in the chat. And now let me introduce you to today's expert panel. We have today two women that I'm very excited to hear what they have to say. That's Binta Dixon and Dr. Julie Sweetland. Binta Dixon is the editor-in-chief of the widely acclaimed Exchange Press, which many of you know is a publication uplifting the voices of leaders in early childhood education. She's worked at the intersection of community building, writing, and education for over a decade. She brings her expertise in writer development and her passion for elevating the brilliance of underrepresented leaders in her work. And Dr. Julie Sweetland is a sociolinguist and a senior advisor at the Frameworks Institute, a nonprofit that equips changemakers to lead productive public conversations on scientific and social issues. Since joining Framework, Dr. Sweetland has designed and led strategic reframing initiatives on issues like climate change, health safety, and childhood adversity. She is very skilled in translating framing research into communication strategies that have helped advocates, policymakers, and scientists drive social change. So let's get started. Let's start with you, Julie. Thank you for joining us today. We're so delighted to have you with us.
Oh, thank you so much. I am delighted to be here, and it's just wonderful to see such a great turnout on the webinar today. I know hundreds more will join afterwards, so thank you to all who are joining today. As Dr. Washington just mentioned, I'm joining today from Frameworks Institute. We're a group of social scientists. We're a nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. And whether we are a linguist like me, a political scientist, a sociologist, or an anthropologist, we use our different areas of expertise and methods and theories to really study the conversations on important scientific and social justice issues. And we've worked in the early childhood sector and on early childhood framing since we got started 25 years ago. And so it is really wonderful to be here and talk about this. And I love connecting it. I love the idea of connecting framing to the idea of courage. So we work on framing, which simple, kind of easy to grasp definition of that is when the process of making choices and how we present ideas. Where do we start? What do we emphasize? How do we explain it? And often, what is it that we need to stop saying? What do we leave unsaid? And framing matters because sometimes relatively small differences in how we present ideas can lead to relatively large differences in how people understand, interpret, and respond to the ideas that we're talking about. So as one example of the type of research we do and just what a frame can do, I'll show you just one quick set of results from a study we did several years ago. This was a large scale survey of many Americans, survey experiment involving a nationally representative sample of Americans. And it was about early childhood and specifically early childhood mental health. And in that study, we were asking, some people logged on and got a message. It was about social prosperity. Some people logged on to the survey experiment and got a message that was about children being vulnerable. So prosperity, children are today's children are the foundation of of a vibrant economic and social setting. Today's children are tomorrow's prosperity kind of message. And the other was about vulnerability, that we really need to pay attention to the needs of our youngest children because they are particularly vulnerable to illness, to adversity, to all these sorts of things. And then there was another group that was the control group, and they got no message. And when we asked folks that either got a social prosperity message or no message or a vulnerability message to respond to, well, do you agree with the idea that early childhood educators should be highly compensated and well supported? Does early learning matter? Do young children have mental health? And if so, do the settings affect it? When we asked questions like that, we saw that the frame really made a difference. When we talked about the importance of of young children's, social emotional learning and mental health in terms of setting the foundation for our future prosperity. That led people to be, up to 8% more, 8 percentage points more supportive of those ideas and policies than the control group. Whereas the message around vulnerability, that if we don't tackle adversity, we're kind of setting up kids to be vulnerable to, social, emotional, relational challenges later in life, that led people in the opposite direction. They actually became less supportive of those good settings for early learners and good supports for the folks that support child mental health, including people like you. So what we emphasize can really bring people towards us, can open minds, build those allies and constituencies, or turn people away. And so that kind of insight is really important to know, if you're working on that issue. But overall, as we think about the role of framing in social change, and courageous framing and really getting where we want society to go, we see framing as the kind of the beginning of catalyzing important social change. Because what we say as mission-driven communicators changes the public discourse. It changes what people hear. And that matters because one of the strongest predictors of what people think is the number of times they have heard it. So if we can come together as a sector with one voice and land on those messages and those frames that really shape the way people think, their knowledge, their attitudes, and their policy preferences will influence the decisions that get made. Whether at the local level, say at the level of a particular childcare provider institution, or at a bigger level, right, in terms of whether or not caregiving and early learners' needs are really seen as a priority in our public policy and budgets. So that theory of change, we've applied this to many issues over our time as an organization, worked with many wonderful partners, particularly in the early childhood sector. So if you've heard the phrases brain architecture or toxic stress, those are framing strategies that have come out of our longstanding partnership with the Harvard Center on the Developing Child and the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. With other partners in the human service sector, we've worked with groups to move away from, well, we should really take care of the poor, but only the poor who are doing the right things, into a conversation that really emphasizes that all of us have needs for supports across the lifespan, and we can be supporting healthy development across the lifespan, whether it's about homes, two-generation approaches to supporting children and families, lots of partners in this area. So we may have crossed paths before. If not, I hope we will be BFFs from now on, best framing friends. So another example of this is how early childhood advocates like you all have already consciously shifted framing tactics, and as a result, opened up space for many more investments and importance, right? A recognition of the importance of the early years than we had a generation ago. So often when I'm working with folks and other issues, on climate change or immigration or health topics, I point to the early childhood sector as one of the kind of rock stars of reframing. Folks for a long time were using a vulnerable child frame to shine a light on the emotional impacts of child abuse and neglect. So if you were around in the 1980s, 1990s, an example of this is the missing kid on the milk carton sort of thing, but it was happening in a lot more places than that. That framing was important at the time because we were coming out of a cultural moment where the adversity and kind of the maltreatment of children was more widely accepted and less regularly talked about. It was seen as kind of a private trouble, a shameful thing that we shouldn't talk about in public. And so that framing of the issue of child maltreatment was important. But as it became a public issue, it was important to shift the frame. All right, we know that good things and bad things can happen to kids. Let's make sure the good things happen. Well, we needed to get into a deeper conversation. And this is where scientists, experts, advocates, child early learning practitioners came together with folks like us to help and really shifted the conversation to the importance of early development and brain development in particular. with this shift in frame, we saw unprecedented investments in early childhood policy and practice. Every state in the nation has kind of an early childhood commission now. There's other sorts of things. I know we've got a long way to go, but we are certainly not where we were a generation ago. And so that really can make a difference. Another type of a framing shift that I think we can show up with and courage on this is moving our overall discussion about doing right by communities, kind of providing resources in communities like opportunities for early learning or skilled caregiving from a narrative or a frame that's about charity, where we as the caring and dedicated providers are giving, right, of ourselves, of our time to the quote unquote needy. Of course, I know if you're here, you absolutely are a caring educator, but that narrative of charity really leaves us vulnerable in the early childhood sector, because if we're doing it out of the love of our hearts, right, it's easy for people to say, well, then that's why they do it. They get the intrinsic rewards. We don't need to think about adequate compensation, sustaining wages, opportunities for professional advancement, good working conditions, etc. But if we can shift the frame on all the human services that we need and deserve across the society, to frame a partnership that we in communities, childcare and employers, et cetera, we are working together to accomplish a shared goal of a community that works for everyone. That's an important frame shift that we can all be participating in. All right, so I've talked a lot about me and about kind of framing, and not me, but frameworks and framing. But I would love to hear a little bit about you. I want to invite you to add to the chat, and this will also give me a moment to pop into the chat and see the comments that have been added as I've been speaking. But I would love to hear a little bit about how and where do you show up as a framer. Perhaps you speak up about making things better if for in early learning settings, in a setting where you work, or maybe where you send your own children. Do you talk with the families you serve in ways that build knowledge, build their skills, or build their power to influence communities and their children's environments and experiences? And when you show up at the soccer game or the baseball, softball field or church or wherever you may be out in the community, do you just share what you know about the importance of early learning, about the process of early development, about the realities of being an early educator? Do you share what you know about early learning when you're out and about in those kind of informal, settings? Or do you advocate for early learners and early educators with public officials, day on the hill sort of things, wherever your hill may be? You could have other ways that you do that you show up as framers as well, but I'll just invite you all to think about that for a moment and add it to the chat. Oh, and I see some of these messages as well that are not that are more effective and less effective, and I'm definitely gonna speak to some of those in a moment. Yeah, and Anne Oswald's question or comment here, that's not effective, the language around we're in it for the outcome, not the income. That speaks right to that idea that I was just sharing about the idea of human services in general, childcare or child early education in particular, being kind of a matter of charity, right? We're in it for the love, and it undermines that livable wage and professionalism, professional respect, right, for early childhood folks. All right. And how are you framers? I got to go through my animations again. We've got folks that write books and articles, show up on podcasts and keynotes. We've got folks that are doing advocacy on early childhood education. What's FFN? I don't know. I got to think about that one for a minute. Um, uh, food and food and family nutrition, community outreach and public officials and committees, or advocate, but we get big pushback from people in power. We're advocating for early learners with public officials. which can be difficult. Ooh, local college funding for our child campus development center. That's a great example of that two-generation framing that we were talking, I mentioned that we worked on with the Ascend at the Aspen Institute and the network there. Oh, thank you, Family, Friend, and Neighbor Care. That's what that stands for. Thanks so much. I love that. I was not familiar with that acronym. All right, so I think we can see from the chat, and I encourage you to read what your fellow participants have put in, that this is a group of folks who are framing. Whether you're doing it kind of consciously or not, you certainly are out there doing it. And I like to say that we are always framing. There's no such thing as a communication where we haven't made some choices, right, about how to present those ideas. And since we are always framing, we should always be framing strategically, right, with respect to what we know about, well, where we're going, what are the changes we're trying to seek, how might people resist them, and how can we work through, work around, navigate, right, public misconceptions. So overall, the framing you do matters because it shapes the cultural mindsets on early learners and related issues. Those cultural mindsets are often working against us, those tired and worn out ideas that, in the end, it all comes down to parents. Of course, parents are important, but we all have a role to play in communities and how children, how early learners are supported. The teachers are in it for the outcome, not the income, right? That those kinds of mindsets are often working against us. Where the science of framing can be helpful to us is in recognizing that many of our common approaches to changing mindsets don't actually work. So it's a part of us it's part of our strategy can be learning about that, but also that courage and that confidence that with the right framing, we can drive change. I'm gonna turn it to Binta in just a moment. So heads up, Binta, I'm coming in on my 2-minute mark. But some of the framing that I would recommend, the mindsets that are unproductive for us and that you may have noticed already, that I believe the early childhood educators' voices can help change, is the idea, for instance, that the real learning starts in K-12. The sector has been highly effective in making the case that the early years matter, why they matter, how they matter, and how we can show through our policies, our budgets, our programs that we know it matters. That is part of the conversation that you are already part of, and I hope you keep framing that. We see in recent research, through the initiative we have with Leading for Kids, that Americans really, it's not that there's a value around children, but they have trouble thinking about environments and policies that shape children that are anything beyond kind of care settings, right? Whether that's a school, or an early learning center, medical care, so they can think about those care settings of various parts, but they're not able to think less able to think about the role of housing, the role of public safety and how we police or have police our communities or have community driven approaches to promoting safety and connection, mental health policy or programs, immigration policy or programs, right? So these kinds of anything else that's outside of a care setting, Americans really struggle to connect that to children's environments and experiences. So you all are as trusted messengers on this issue can help to shape that narrative that all of our policies are policies that affect kids, and every policy we set, we should be looking at it to say, what is the effect on early learning, early development, and is it having the effect we want? How is it showing up in the lives of children and the adults in their lives, including you all? And then the sense that if you're working with the little ones, you're just a babysitter or a daycare staffer. And we need to, and I know you all know this, I'm preaching to the choir here, but the work you are doing to tell a new narrative that this is a skilled and essential professional sector is working. We see mindsets in America shifting on this. Of course, the pandemic really brought it to light, how essential, right, folks who work with young children are. But we have more to go. This is a moment where we can really build on that change in progress to get to a new framing space. So We have lots of research to and resources to help you do that. I would encourage you all to visit our website. And of course, as always, the CAYL Institute creates that curated resource list to go with this webinar, but I'll say that what we're trying to accomplish by making resources like this available and by encouraging and affirming folks like you who are changing the conversation, we're trying to think about, how can we show up in society? And in a fragmented system like early childhood, it's really easy for each of us to talk about young learners and the people who support them in totally different ways. It's like we're each a different arrow, right? And maybe we're overlapping, but maybe we're contradicting each other, stepping, really not being speaking with a shared voice. And because the strongest predictor of what people will believe is the number of times we've heard it, if we are all over the map like this, if our messages are going in every different direction, we are missing opportunities to have the ideas we want on surround sound and have that shape how people think. So we have an alternative. By looking to the science of framing, by realizing that because we're always framing, we should always be framing strategically, we can have our influence, our voices in society seem a little bit more like this. It's not that every one of us needs to say the exact same 3 magic words, right? This is a bumper sticker or a slogan. It's not going to shift mindsets at the level and scale that we need. And some of us are in settings where we can be kind of out front and really sharp, and some of us are in settings where we need to take a more measured approach, right? In our tone, in our communications. That's okay, as long as we are all kind of emphasizing and amplifying ideas that go in the same general direction. We are concentrating our influence rather than diluting it. We are using strategy and courage to really change thinking. I was so pleased to see Valora use the James Baldwin quote at the top. I thought about using that one at the end of my talk. I often do use that one, and I'm glad I didn't because it would have been repetitive. So I've got this one instead. I want to remind you all that a talent for speaking differently rather than arguing well is the chief instrument of cultural change. The science and the data on the importance of early learning is clear. But if we just beat people over the head with those numbers, that's not going to do a lot of good. But if we can organize around shared resonant stories and strategies, we really can create that cultural change that we need as a sector and that we need for young learners. That's what I've got to say for now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Binta. Hi, Binta.
Hello. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to start mine now. All right. Hello, everyone. So excited to be here with you today. And I saw someone in the chat say, I think it was Jamie Bitten that said, "We are the professional workforce behind the world's workforce." And I absolutely agree. And what I'm going to talk about today is how we can connect our personal narratives to the collective narratives to really amplify impact. And I think this is really important because before we can confidently speak about the professionalism, the work, and the expertise that we have in our field, we have to really own that for ourselves. And each of us can do that when we own our individual stories. And I want to start by talking about a little bit about my story. So, as a model. So it's really important for me to talk about the why. And for me, the why is all about my childhood. I grew up in a family childcare environment, and I was raised by social workers and educators. I watched their resilience. I watched them collaborate. I watched them work with a variety of kinds of people to really make this work happen on a management level and on a childcare level. And because I was raised in this environment, I really felt from a very young age, it was important to tell these stories. I saw all this work happening, and I didn't see that really being uplifted in a lot of spaces. And so from really young age, I was clear that I wanted to write stories and help to share these stories of educators. However, somewhere along the way, I also got some messaging that being a writer, being a community organizer wasn't enough, that I needed to somehow be more. I didn't see the value in what it was that I was bringing, in my skills I had developed and everything that I learned. So by the time I went to graduate school in Miami, I did not pursue writing. I did not pursue community organizing. I was in another field. And there was this story of expectation versus reality. I had an experience where I was feeling very isolated in an academic setting. I was seeing all of these conversations happening, and it wasn't involving the community that we were actually talking about. And so what I did was I went to find my own community, and I found Girl Power, which was an organization that supported children and families. And that's when I really found my passion again and my commitment to supporting educators. They had a program that supported young mothers, and that is where I started to uplift the work of the educators and the community supporters there. And I really found my passion again for digital storytelling, advocacy, and education. And some of the words, after I was able to alchemize this story, after I was able to really own this for myself, I had to pivot in my career, in my training, so that I could get the skills and enhance those skills so that I could be an effective storyteller and advocate for educators. So I pivoted, and then I also was able to go on to support Head Start programs and Montessori programs and different educators through early care and K through 12, and supporting their leadership, their thought leadership, and getting those stories out there to the world for advocacy and to shine a light on the amazing work that is done. And now some words that I use to describe myself and how I've owned my story are adaptive, a professional encourager, that's one of my favorite, collaborative, heart-centered, truth teller, and creative. When you consider the challenges, the character development, and the joys of your story, what words come to mind? And if you would like, you can put that in the chat. I'd love to see some of those words that you think of when you think of your early care and education journey and story. These are some of our partners. I want to thank the CAYL Institute for being such an amazing partner for Exchange. We really value your partnership and collaboration. And it's just this, congratulations on your 40th webinar. They're really, truly a benefit to the field. And here at Exchange Press, we could not do our work without your stories. And I think that shows it really underpins the work that we do here. And we want to be a place where you can share your ideas, connect, and grow with other professionals. So I started with this quote because I think that when we think about equity and we think about having an impact, sometimes we do not think about the power of our personal stories. But your story can be a valuable source of inspiration for others. When we talk about framing, as Dr. Sweetland did, when we create a connection between our personal narrative and the collective narrative we want to share, we really have the capacity to help to change beliefs and mindsets. So I'll tell a little story. When I was at NACCE in 2023, it was my first time being able to go to this conference. I sat in a room that was spilling over. It was a panel of Black women leaders who wrote the book, Stories of Resistance, which was published by Exchange Press. There were so many folks in that room that just wanted to share their experience, to show their appreciation for the authors, and to share space with folks who understood where they were coming from. I overheard one woman say that she'd always wanted to write about her experiences in leadership, but she felt like she wasn't a writer. And I immediately felt like I had to go and speak with her because I really want to continue to challenge the idea that to be able to share our stories, you have to be a writer by trade or by experience. You do not have to be any of those things to share an impactful message. Who gets to tell the stories in our field is really important. And we know that there are folks who are not involved in our field, who are sharing narratives about how much compensation should happen, the quality and the impact of our work, and they're trying to shape that narrative. When we share our stories, we challenge the false narratives and we help to create a holistic picture of the work that's happening in our field. And I also want to talk about, this is really important, when we share our stories, to understand that they're not happening in a vacuum. What we really need, in my experience, is a collective of main characters. And if you haven't heard the term main character energy, it basically means placing your experiences front and center in your own life, effectively owning your story. So before we can go out and effectively advocate for early childcare education, we have to own our part in this story. Many of you here have done phenomenal work for many years, advocating, teaching, supporting as coaches, as administrators, as directors. There are thousands of stories, thousands of examples that you can share with folks to help them understand the value of that work. We need a collective of educators and leaders who own their stories, because when we come together, we can challenge this idea that we're going it alone. It can feel isolating sometimes when we're doing our work. Often when we're just in the process of doing, we don't always take time to reflect. When we can own those experiences, even the challenges and the joys, we can help to see that we are the hero of our own story, and we come together to play our particular role and share those benefits with the whole. So the components and why storytelling. I mean, there's so many ways to be an advocate and to speak out about the needs of folks in the field. Why is storytelling an avenue that you should consider? Well, I think that when we take the time to reflect, it reveals a lot, not only in our professional lives, but in our personal lives. Often I find that folks who are really embedded in the work do not always see the gems, the expertise, and those little moments that really explain and show their expertise and wisdom. So by writing your own narrative and kind of taking one story from your life and examining it, you can help to see your values. You can help to see what are those PowerPoints that you have in your life that's really helped to shape who you are. You can reclaim some of your challenges as character development and find other folks who resonate with what you've experienced to collaborate with them. I think a lot of times, to the point of isolation, we all have our particular stories, but there is a through line. We can weave them together into a cohesive narrative, but we can only really do that when we're honest and we're aware of the things that we've experienced and how those fit into some of the systemic issues that we face and some of those solutions. I truly believe that we all have pieces of the solution to any challenge we face in our field. So when we come together to be able to share those individual experiences, we really have the best opportunity to be impactful. Right. I see some of the words that you shared here: consistency and care. I love that one. Kindness, determination, communication. I tell my story as a survivor, inviting others to share theirs in a safe, respectful setting. Yes, these are the ways. Understanding these power words, these words that help us reclaim our stories for ourselves, are so key when we are framing and then we are expressing and using our personal narrative. So after you've taken some time to examine the stories of your life, what is that next step? And I want to go to this quote. This is from Stories of Resistance, one of my favorite quotes from this book, and it is by Megan Green. And one of the things I love about this is we get to decide the words that we use to describe our story and the aspects of the story we want to share. We all have intersecting identities. We all have a variety of ways that we show up. But when we are sharing our story, we get to be empowered to share the parts that make the most sense. Like when I was sharing my story, I didn't share everything. I hit on the highlights, and that's appropriate. Whenever you are looking to inspire, whenever you're looking to make a difference with your story, you want to be strategic about the points that you share. And you may have several versions of that story, depending on the audience that you're talking to. And that helps you to be the one to really direct that narrative and feel like you have a sense of ownership over your own story. Who's telling the story, as I said, really matters. So the elements of an impactful story. Once you've had the chance to own the story for yourself, now it's time to really think about how you want to use it. And in terms of figuring out what are those specific stories of my life that I want to use when I'm talking to folks and advocating for early care and education. These are just some questions you can ask yourself to kind of find that, especially if you're struggling with that piece of, well, what are my power words? What are the stories from my career, from my profession, or from my life that really can have an impact. These are some of the ones. And two of the ones that I feel like are sometimes overlooked but really important are, when is the time you felt like an outsider? And it's not to focus on the negative experience. It's to focus on how you overcame that. When was the time you felt like an outsider, and what happened from that? How did you find belonging for yourself? What did you do to support yourself? What support network did you find out of that experience? And then when was the last time you did something that challenged you? I know that we all face many challenges. And when we are able to kind of find the gems in those challenges and what we learned, the strengths that emerge from those challenges, is when we can then take that experience and make it into one of our origin stories. So even if you don't consider yourself to be an advocate, even if you're not going down to, your local political office, or you're not going to your senator on a regular basis, you don't have to be an advocate or be knowledgeable about the fine points of policy to share a meaningful, real example that impacts policy. Legislators want to hear from their constituents. They have a lot of people in their ear talking about what they should and shouldn't do, but the most impactful stories, the most impactful words are going to come from people like you, people who are working in early care and education, who can share the fine details of what you do every day that makes you the workforce behind the world's workforce. Explain that to someone by taking them into your day-to-day work. That when you're able to own your story and craft a narrative that is both authentic and emotionally compelling, you can inspire, rally folks around a specific goal using this story. For example, even if you're not necessarily going to a legislator and you're looking to partner more closely with your families, how can you use a story of your center, of your care environment, to really help to show people why you need that support, to help people feel a sense of inspiration around supporting you? That is one of the powerful aspects of story for me. And more about why story. What does story really do on an emotional and psychological level? One thing is that when we share from our lived experience, we help to transport our audience into the story. When we can share from something that's actually happened to us, we're relatable. Someone can say, wow, yeah, that hasn't exactly happened to me, but I can see and feel what you mean. Additionally, we can emotionally connect with people. When you share, maybe this is what happened, this is what I was thinking at the time, this is how it felt, it creates an empathy. It creates the ability for someone to not only just hear the words that you're saying and understand on an intellectual level, but really have compassion and feel for what is being said. And that is persuasive. We know that to have a persuasive argument and to really make change, people need to feel things on multiple levels. And when you share, and when you're able to do that, you're inherently connecting folks and helping to shift beliefs, because oftentimes these are beliefs that have been ingrained and sometimes do not reflect the realities of our field. So when we're able to share authentically, we maybe get someone to shift a widely held idea, such as early childcare professionals are babysitters. When you're sharing about the intentionality, the administrative work, the pedagogy, and the core competencies that you possess, that's going to easily shift someone into having that mentality. A bit on connection. So we know that also stories connect people to each other, and not just the folks who you may be trying to advocate for, or maybe trying to get to understand a certain thing, but your colleagues, the folks who you do this work with. Sharing your story, some of the challenges you faced, some of the ways you found solutions with them can help build stronger bonds within your work environment and among your families as well. So when you're crafting your story, you want to make sure that you're sharing your experience. And then the next part of that is outlining the impact for the audience. So that's getting a little bit into the framing. When you start and you think about, okay, now I have this idea of what I've seen, what I've been through, what I've accomplished. what is the outcome I want to see? What is the the issue that I want to tackle? Maybe it is compensation. So you want to outline a couple points of impact for the audience. If it is around funding, what is the impact of not having that funding? What is the impact of getting that funding for your organization? Illustrate the change that's needed, and then provide examples and calls to action. What do you want to see happen? What do you want people to do to support you? When you have those components of, this is what I've personally seen and experienced, this is what it means in the greater world, in our greater field, this is what I want to see happen, and this is how you can help me make that happen, you really have a powerful tool for change. And I also want to talk a little bit about method, because you don't have to be a storyteller. You don't have to be a writer per se to share your story. There's so many ways that you can get your story out there. You can, and there is a long tradition of oral history that comes in many of our communities. And we can use that today because of the technology that we have. You can record yourself sharing your story. You can practice doing that in your own living room with your staff. Record a short video kind of telling a story from the day in the life and your experience, and use that as a jumping off point to think about, what were those key moments that I really want folks to understand about my work? What was happening here in this exchange of a child walking into the center? What was happening when I was thinking about staffing for that day and how to support professional development? And then you use that story to have a conversation, to help other folks understand where you're coming from, and also maybe to do some training or some education. You can also, of course, write more, use that one story to expand it, and write a book or write a longer narrative. Use your story to inspire you to collect stories from others. Another way is just in sharing as a group. So a lot of times we can be afraid to speak out. And one of the ways we can build that courage of speaking out is having a small group to share your story with. Get together with a few people, tell your stories, exchange stories, encourage each other, and then use that as an action plan. Decide what you want to do, what impact you want to have collectively, and take that into the next step. But maybe it's writing something together. Maybe it's designing your own webinar. Maybe it's designing just a video or a group that meets regularly. There's really the potential is unlimited when it comes to storytelling and making an impact. And so I want to end on this quote. And I also want to say this. If you are someone whose first language is not English, please consider sharing your story in your first language. I guarantee you there are folks who will benefit from hearing you reading or sharing your story in that language. We can always do translations. We can always, have it widely available to other folks, but your first language, your culture, your perspective is so valuable, and it's great to start there. What I love about this quote is that when we reflect on our identities by owning our stories, we stand confidently in the fact that early care and education professionals are vital to our society, to children, to families. We could not have the world that we have without you. It starts with you knowing your value and the true power of your work. Thank you so much. And we're actually going to move into a discussion. So I will hand that over to Dr. Washington. Thank you.
Wow, I am just so filled with new learning and new thoughts. I really appreciate both of you for what you're sharing and bringing with us today. There are so many questions I have in the limited time. So I want to say, I know many of you have questions. There'll be a link at the end of this webinar. Don't hesitate to click it. And if you want to talk with these two excellent leaders, you can join us to talk with them directly. So I would like to say, Julie, you talked about always be framing, and we always are framing, right? And so, whether you're talking to legislators, but whether you're talking to your families, your other teachers, your colleagues, or whether you're talking to somebody at the nail salon, how we present our issues matters so much. So I want to just say something and get a reaction from both of you. We have kind of bad words and good words. So I want to say, a bad word, to me, a really bad word, is this word called they care. which is still very, very, very heavily used in our field. I go to meetings, I hear that word all the time, and I think about it as a bad word. Then we think about good words, like a really great word that I love, play. And so, how do we, as we always be framing, help people to think about these words that we're using? The good word play that many people cannot accept as being a valid part of the work that we do with children, or sometimes the words we use with ourselves saying, I'm a daycare teacher. Can you two speak to that?
Such a good question. And I bet a lot of the strategy for getting those words better understood is going to be connected to personal story. So I can't wait to hear what Binta has to say about this. As a linguist, as a framing scientist, what I can say is that often the words, what they need to, if we need to shift the language, we also have to shift people's understanding of them, right? So people think play is wonderful. It's not like people think play is bad, but they don't understand. We see there's a lack of understanding. The public lags behind early education's understanding of what play does and why it matters. So the word itself, right, might be fine, but you've got to tag that reframed definition of it. You've got to do something to shift people's understanding of it as kind of a time where nothing important happens to a time when all the important stuff happens in early childhood. And similar to daycare, right? I mean, I think it is the problem with it, right, is that it kind of diminishes and devalues again, the very important child development work that is happening in those childcare settings. Going around and shaking our fingers at all the moms that call it daycare, right? That's not going to be a winning strategy. And I know you didn't mean it that way, or we would never do that. But that's one of those things where the language we use, we need to be consistent about it. And just as you might just gently recast, a child's language to say, oh, you mean please, or something like that. You might just gently recast it. You could do that sort of thing with families, but be unapologetic and bold, right? In those advocacy settings to say, we are early educators. This is early learning. This is vital work. This is not something where it's not a warehouse for kids. So the, parents can go to work, right? This is work valid and worthy in its own right. Binta, what do you want to say about it?
Yes, well, I think you're right on, Julie. When it does come back to those personal narratives. So a way to reframe is to look at all the development aspects that are happening in play. And what came to mind immediately is our Nature Explorer program with that's a part of Dimensions in Exchange. There's 10 principles they use to design those spaces. So when a child is playing in those spaces, they're doing fine motor development. They're practicing their gross motor development skills. There's a teacher there who is helping to help them navigate these spaces in a way that's intentional. So helping folks to see like, oh, there's a lot that's going into play to make it safe for the child, to make it effective for the child, to make it a place of curiosity and wonder. There takes a lot of skill, a lot of intention, and also pre-work for that. So just simply in a story, you can, in a couple moments, you can help folks to understand what's really happening in terms of when we're talking about play. And it's way more than daycare. That is part of education.
Absolutely. And I see the rage text coming through in the chat. So this is clearly something that strikes a nerve. And I just want to invite everyone to write just one little letter to the editor, 300 words. Next time you see daycare in the local blog or newspaper, or you hear a legislator saying it, call up the staffer and say, we don't want to hear that anymore. Like you're like, just anytime you can kind of speak up in those more public discourse settings to challenge that word, other people will realize we want to vote that one off the island, and then the language on the island will change.
Yeah, I love combining what you're saying. We tell people who we are too by our words. And I love that we're teaching people who we are, and we're teaching people how to treat us as well. I love these ideas about reclaiming our challenges as character development. I love these ideas about finding points of power and collaboration. I love the idea of what the expectation is versus the reality. So this is something that I've dealt with a lot as a teacher educator and also in my role as an administrator. Many people, I think, want to come into early childhood education at first because, they just love kids, and how great it's going to be able to just be with kids, that expectation, and then the reality where it is a highly skilled work that takes years to develop a really high levels of expertise and professionalism. And so I love this idea of bringing the framing aspect into our thinking about our work, our teaching people who we are helping people understand the professionals that we are. I'm wondering what you might add to that expectation and reality.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful thing. I think that we can help folks to understand what the true reality of the work is when we explain it through our own experiences. How long does it take to really gain that professionalism to be able to go into the classroom, and what it takes to continue? There's continued learning that happens. So talking openly more about
Mhm.
the journey of becoming an educator and all that's required, I think is so key. And we do that a lot at Exchange. We recently had the millionth CDA recipient there. So talking about like what it takes for someone to put their other responsibilities and come into a space where they're taking hours, days, weeks out of their life to go through trainings on a consistent basis, licensure, regulatory practices, having to get your center or your family care center's license is a huge undertaking. Those are all a part of the profession. And yes, there are beautiful parts of it too, but talking more about the management aspects, talking more about the aspects of skill development, I think is key to that, setting realistic expectations.
Mhm.
Yeah, on the reality versus expectation line of thinking, I think I'll take it in a little bit different direction, which is if we are understanding the expectations of the world that people are coming with. People are not blank slates. We know that's true of the children we teach, but we don't always think about like kind of the culture or the public like that. People are coming with prior associations, and learning to see a world, right, that they have seen every day, right? And so we need to think about the prior assumptions, not models, mental models people have in crafting our communications. And we understand that we're breaking those expectations, which means we've got to be really good at filling in like new ways of seeing reality. Also, hot question that just came in. I got a direct message about my lipstick, and it's just drugstore lipstick. It's Maybelline.
Oh my. Well, let's realize that our hour is coming toward an end. What I have really learned so much from both of you. It's so empowering. Who gets to tell our story? And how can we use this research on framing to do an even better job of telling our story? Thank you so much, Binta and Julie. So grateful for you. And if you want to interact with them and ask them a question or make your own comment, please click the link that we're providing in the chat right now. And then as soon as this webinar is over, you'll be able to interact with Binta and Julie. So we've been thinking about all of these questions for a very long time and offer many resources for you to be able to look at them. And we hope that you do. We hope that you'll enjoy the follow-up email we send that will give you more resources about how to dig deeper into this issue of framing. And I also want to say to you that please sign up and register for our next webinar, Showing Up with Courage for Compensation Justice. If you want to know how we can show up with courage to talk about and deal with the issue of compensation justice, I invite you to join us on September 5th at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time. And we can never end a webinar without thanking our amazing staff who do so much to move our work forward at the CAYL Institute and to be partners with all of you as early childhood educators. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in the post conversation if you join us. Good night.